Okay, so now we're going to start the first plenary of AIMOS 2022, and that'll be given by Patrick Forscher and Joel Wambua. So Patrick and Joel work for the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics in Kenya, which is a non-profit research and advisory center that uses behavioral science in service of alleviating poverty. So Patrick is a meta-researcher whose work is focused on making behavioral science more robust, useful, and fair. And he works as a research lead for the Busara Center, where he manages Busara's internal research agenda, focused on culture, research ethics, and methods. And prior to Busara, Patrick served as a research scientist at the University of Grenoble-Alpes, finding lead at the Psychological Science Accelerator, and was an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas. And his co-presenter Joel is a research specialist at Busara, where he leads an agenda on ethical research. And the main objective of this agenda is to conduct empirical research into the preference of research participants, close feedback loops, and strengthen participant voices. And Joel's research interests lie in applied behavioral science, specifically in questions relating to economic development, public policy, reproducibility, and research ethics. And Joel has a background in economics and sociology. So everyone would like to welcome Patrick and Joel to the stage.
Hey everyone, it's interesting to be the first talk of the day. I hope I start the day off on the right foot. As a way of framing my talk, there we go. So this is a world map scaled to the number of people in each country. And this is a world map scaled to the amount of published research in each country. And if you compare the two, you'll see there are some differences. Especially there's a lack of published research in areas that I'll be calling for the purposes of this talk, the Global South. And if you look, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where our organization is located, there's not a lot of research coming out there at all. This is a framing device to understand the generalizability problem. So I'm focused specifically on the generalizability of behavioral science and the generalizability of behavioral science findings to areas in the Global South, where you can see there's not a lot of research coming out of those locations. This is not a new problem, and it's a problem that has a lot of commentary over the years. My background is in psychology, so I'm going to be drawing some examples of commentaries from psychology. But back in 1986, there was this famous paper with the provocative title, "College Sophomores in the Laboratory." And it was basically complaining about how we're making all these like wild generalizations to all people on the basis of college sophomores, mostly in the United States. Later on, there was this paper called The Neglected 95%, basically making the same problem. This is again in psychology, American Psychologist, a pretty well-known journal in psychology. This one, a lot of people know this one. It's got the title "The Weirdest People in the World" by Joe Henrich and colleagues, making basically the same claim, the same point as these other papers. Later on, this is a newer one. It's called The Neglected 95% Revisited. This is making the same point as that paper by Arnett, saying, hey, we've got all this narrow database, we're making these wild generalizations. And it was also trying to find out, well, have things gotten any better since we looked at all of these commentaries? And one of their headline findings was that, well, no, it hasn't. So one statistic that I like to pull out just to illustrate this problem dramatically is less than 1% of all papers in APA journals over this time period had samples or first authors from Africa. less than 1%. And the last time I checked, Africa has about 18% of the population. So really, when I say that a lot of these papers are making wild generalizations to people that maybe they shouldn't, that's what I mean. So, like I said, this is not a new problem. And one of the exciting things about the meta-science or open science movement is that there have been a variety of new organizations to try to address this problem. I've been involved in some of these. So this talk is going to reflect some on those different initiatives to try to figure out like what's working and what is. So one of those initiatives is the Psychological Science Accelerator. This is an organization that's trying to do what I like to call big team science, which is massively collaborative science. Usually that's internationally collaborative. I've been pretty active in the PSA, so I'm going to reflect on those experiences. This next initiative is led by a PhD student I worked with named Ade Adatula. That's Ade right there. He's doing big team science, but specifically focused on Africa. And I'll refer to a couple of those initiatives later on in the talk. And finally, there's the organization that I currently work for, the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. As Matt Page just described, we're a research and advisory center headquartered in Nairobi. And both Joel and I work on the research wing of Busara. So I'll draw on those experiences as well. The structure of the talk is as follows. First, I'm going to review two categories of approaches to the generalizability problem. Next, I'm going to critique those approaches, and I'll be critiquing an approach, for example, big team science that I've been involved with. So I've got some skin in the game here, and I'm calling myself out a little bit. Next, I'll describe more explicitly what I think those approaches are missing, and finally, I'll talk about what I think those approaches could be doing better. So one approach to addressing the generalizability problem is something that I'll call a north-south partnership. This is basically collaboration between usually a principal investigator in the global north and either a principal investigator or some sort of partner in the global south. I'm going to talk about the economic model of what this approach usually uses in a bit, but I just want to highlight here that hanging over this entire topic of approaches to the generalizability problem is the issue that resources in the global south, and especially Africa, are scarce. So one statistic to illustrate this is that there's no country in Africa currently that spends more than 1% on research and development. So if you're trying to do research in those circumstances, you're in a situation of resource constraints. So usually what the economic model of this kind of partnership looks like is that you have the global north partner that brings with them free time to spend on various things, and some source of money. The global south partner, as I mentioned, is usually in a situation of resource constraints. So they might have some money, but it's less available than it is for the global north partner, usually. They bring labor. They bring some sort of infrastructure. And what I'm referring to here, especially, is data collection infrastructure. Some workflows or management or connections that makes data collection relatively, at least something that they can do. They also have expertise on the context that they're doing the data collection in. So what this economic model usually looks like is that the global north partner uses the thing that they have in excess, which in this case is money, and they send some of that money to the global south partner. They also usually have a design in mind that they want to execute, and they can provide some high-level management to ensure that the project gets done. What the global south partner usually provides is data. This is the fundamental exchange in this type of partnership: money for data. They also provide some local management on the ground. And one thing I want to highlight here is that the Global North partner is operating on a slightly different economy than the Global South partner. The Global North partner is usually operating on the academic credit economy. So what they get out of this is a paper. They spend the cost, which is the money, and they get out of it a paper which helps them advance their career. But the Global South partner is usually on a different economy. That's the money economy, because they need the money in order to, make a living. So that's, I think, a big difference between the two partners in this sort of model. This is the economic model that Busara is in. So I mentioned that we have a research side to us. We do papers that fit this model. This is one of them. Johannes Haashofer is one of the co-founders of Busara. This paper, we did a randomized controlled trial to see if giving people cash versus giving people therapy would help people feel better. Spoiler alert, the cash does all the work, the therapy doesn't do any of the work. This is a project that we did with Johannes and a few other people. It's a project that I think we could rightly be proud of. I'm going to be coming back to this project later. I just want to note here that this is something that Busara does. This is a model that many people operate in, and good work comes out of it. Busara in particular, I mentioned the Global South partner is usually bringing some sort of infrastructure. What we bring is a very large lab that you would find, say, at a psychology department. It's the largest one in Africa. This is a photo of it. We also have the ability to build labs in other places. So we find, say, a place in upcountry Kenya that's suitable to set up a lab. This is called Lab in the Field. We bring people there and we do projects there. So there are different ways that we and other partners can operate. I'm going to call this the Global South partner as the service provider. So essentially this, I think this model puts the Global South partner in this position of providing a service, which is delivering research or executing research. Another approach that has become more popular lately, partly because of my involvement, although I'm definitely not the only person doing this, is what I'll call big team science. So the intuition behind this model is that there are researchers all over the world who have their own infrastructure set up to collect or recruit participants close to where they are. They can recruit a convenient sample. However, those research labs are distributed all over the world. So if you can get everybody on board to work on the same protocol, you can get a much more, at least nationally diverse sample than you could if any one of those labs were doing the work on their own. There are a bunch of organizations now that are constructed to facilitate this process. One of them is one that I did a lot of work on, the Psychological Science Accelerator. However, there's also CREME, there's the many lab style of studies. There are a bunch of these. This is a project conducted by or led by my friend and colleague, Nick Coles, the current director of the Psychological Science Accelerator. I also contributed to this project, and I'm going to critique it later. So I just want you to know I'm not just dragging him, I'm also dragging myself. One thing I want to highlight is that it is highly collaborative. There are a lot of names on this. The conclusion from this project, they were investigating whether smiling makes you feel happy. This has been a controversial idea in psychology. They claim that, yes, it is across a very nationally diverse sample. This is an amazing project. Even though I'm going to critique it, I do think it's a really cool project. So let's talk a bit about the economic model behind this, this big team science idea. Usually you have a lead team. The lead team is the team that is, leading the project. And what they provide principally is labor. You also have a bunch of data collection teams usually. They provide labor, infrastructure, and context expertise. We're seeing some of the same things that we saw in the North-South partnership model. And usually there are a bunch of these data collection teams. What the lead team provides in this model is usually high-level management and a design. But I want to emphasize here, the design is the primary thing that's being exchanged here. It's not money. And what the data collection teams provide is data and local management. What I want to emphasize here is that all the teams are supposed to be on the academic credit model. So the thing that everybody gets out of this exchange is a paper. The lead team gets a higher authorship place, but the data collection teams also get a place on that authorship list. And the idea behind the big team science model is that some of those teams in many of these different locations can be from the Global South. All right. So one of the problems with the first of these models, the North-South partnership model, is that the design is primarily coming from the Global North partner. It doesn't have to, but because this is a model that involves an exchange of money, it's a bit of a hard sell for the Global South partner to say, no, actually, I want you to pay me to work on your idea. And remember, the Global North partner is also on the academic credit model. The primary thing that they're getting out of this is the credit, which means coming up with the idea. So that's going to be a very hard sell. In essence, this model squeezes out the voice of the Global South partner, which means that it's harder for the Global South partner to express their ideas or express what they think we should think about their context. However, this problem also occurs at the level of participants. So Joel, would you mind coming up here and saying a few words about this study from the perspective of the participants?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Patrick. So this was a study that was done in Kenya in one of the local villages. And the thing is, we were trying to see whether giving cash to people, giving psychotherapy training to people makes them happy, improve their psychological well-being. Now, like Patrick said, the model that is used when doing such kind of studies is a researcher comes from the Global North with the money, and then the implementation team from the Global South provides local management of the project. And the problem with such kind of an approach is that most of the time the context is ignored. When you come with your design, when you're a researcher from the Global North, you come with your design already written on paper and very difficult to adjust. The budget already drawn out, without speaking to anyone from the Global South or anyone who understands the context where you're coming to implement the study. Problems occur when that happens. Because, for example, when you talk about cash, you would assume that like giving people a lot of money would make everything fine. Like if somebody gives you some cash without you doing anything, the assumption would be that, yeah, that person would be happy, everything would be fine. But in this case, that assumption was wrong. It's because if you look at the context of where this study was done, the cash was actually $500 US, like giving to people like cash. So there's a lot of money in these villages. That's kind of double the monthly wages of the participants. So the assumptions that giving someone or people such kind of money in that village would make them happy was wrong. And it was wrong because if you look at most experiments that are done, like you randomize people into control, treatment, and all that stuff. So some people get the money, others don't. And you see, that creates a problem. If you don't think about that earlier on when designing your study, then you are bound to run into problems. And that is what happened in this project. So what happened is that little resources were spared for sort of like engaging the community and trying to figure out if doing this study there would cause problems. So what we did, we just went, spoke to the local leaders got permits from the IRB as usual, you know. But IRBs don't live in the villages. They are somewhere in our office, like reading whether the protocols are scientifically valid, and the context is always ignored. So what happened is that when we went to implement the study, we did a very nice baseline. We spoke to people. We just read the consent, explained the study. And this happened to the people that were selected to participate in this study. We didn't involve the entire community. We didn't, anyone who was outside the study didn't know what was happening. This was like a black box to them. And when we came to implement the interventions, like giving people the actual money, that's where the problem began, you know. One thing is that, you know, when the randomization was done at the household level and only one person from that household, whether the household head, that is the husband or the wife, was selected to participate. And given the strict nature of protocols, and you need to control how the information is being transferred from the researcher to the participants, things were a little bit unclear. People didn't know what was happening. Why are people coming in suddenly and giving money? So what would happen is that you'd have household A receiving 500 USD, and then household B receiving nothing, you know, just neighbor, something that is you just wonder, where did my neighbor get a windfall of such amount of money? And with that, now the problem started, you know, people started spreading rumors about the source of this money. It's blood money. So if you get this money, your child is going to die. They're going to sacrifice somebody from your household and all that stuff, Illuminati. We had instances of domestic violence, because if your spouse gets $500 from nobody knows where, and then you just come and find out that, oh, my wife just came back with a lot of money and you don't know where this money came from, then we had some instances of domestic violence, and as well as the enumerators were also in danger, you know. When actually people saw that the money was real and some people are getting money, others are not getting money. The other people didn't get the money, people in control group, people who are not in the study, the people who received the psychotherapy program also were not happy with this. And just because we didn't spend enough time to understand the context and what this would mean to the community, giving people such kind of money, what that would mean to the community, we ran into problems. The study couldn't continue. We had to stop for 3 months to address this problem. There's no way we could proceed with the study without going back, taking a step back and doing this the proper way. Spending time with the community, trying to understand their concerns, trying to see what problems this study could cause and how to address them. We didn't actually come up with the solutions ourselves, because we don't know what happened. So the thing is, it's really important as researchers who do research in the global south to try, and not even try, to spare some resources and time to listen to the voices of the participants, as well as the local experts. As you design your studies, it's really important that you spare time and resources for this crucial initial step. Otherwise, while such kind of programs mean well, they might cause some negative after effects that you didn't want. You know, you give people money, some are happy, but in the long run, the entire community is in disarray because some people didn't get money, others got money, and you leave people more sadder than you found them. So that is the takeaway you got from this, and I would like to share with all of us. Always find time and resources for understanding the context of where you're working.
So I'd say overall, the primary problem with this North-South partnership model is lack of voice. And this manifests both on the researcher side and on the participant side, as you just heard from Joel. Let's talk about the big team science model. So one thing I want to point out with this model is that across all three of these initiatives, there are no published studies so far with a Global South first author. So this issue of lack of voice also applies to the big team science model, at least as it's implemented now. But the other problem that I want to identify is related to this economic model that I laid out. So looming over all of these issues, as I mentioned before, is the problem that we're dealing with resource constrained settings. And this model assumes that everybody's on the academic credit model and that the resources are taken care of. So you could ask the question, where's the money coming from in this model? And the assumption is that everybody's relying on their own money, that everybody's bringing their own money to the table, whether that's in the form of their work being subsidized by their university because people are teaching or otherwise. So whereas we did have an explicit transfer of money in the earlier model, the North-South partnership model, there's no transfer in this model. So if we bring that back to the project that I pointed out that I am an author on, just as a reminder, I don't think it should be surprising that if we look at where the authors are coming from, where the data is coming from, there's very little in Africa or in these other places that I identified as the Global South. And that is because of this economic model, because this economic model assumes that everybody's got the resources taken care of. And also, you know, if you look within the sample of each of these different academic institutions, these are convenience samples. There are samples where people are young, about college aged, and female, as usually the case in psychology studies. These are convenience samples. These aren't representative samples. And finally, if we think about just the idea of the facial feedback hypothesis, this is the idea that smiling makes you happy. This is a hypothesis that does have a long history, but it has a long history in Europe. The people who proposed it are people like, you know, Charles Darwin or William James. So what we have is, I know this wasn't the intention, but what we have is a study that is investigating the ideas put forward by people from the Global North, and where a few people from the Global South are putting in labor so that the findings could go back to the Global North. To me, this is uncomfortably close to a colonial system. I just want to put a plug here for a group that's working on this very issue in big team science. It's called AGRIER. My slides are online if you want to find them. They're doing good work to try to, you know, work on this model and make it a bit more fair. So I'd say the principal problem with the big team science model is that the economic model does not apply to everybody. And a second problem is that as they're implemented right now, these collaborations tend to work on ideas that are put forward by people from the Global North. So let's talk a bit about what ends up being missing. And I mean missing in the sense of, you know, what kinds of ideas are we not exploring because of these limitations with how we're approaching generalizability. So first, to get a sense of what we might be missing, I want to zoom in on one particular country that has a sample in this Many Smiles project, and that's Nigeria. I fixed this in my slides, but maybe it's not here. There's about 113 people representing Nigeria in this study, and they're from one particular university, which is I don't know how to pronounce this, but Alex Akume Federal University. So about 100 people at one particular university. The thing is, Nigeria is huge, and it's also extremely varied, more so than many countries in the world. So for one thing, there's about 200 million people in Nigeria. There's 525 languages spoken and about 250 ethnic groups. There's also a huge difference between northern Nigeria, which is mostly Muslim and populated by the Hausa, and southern Nigeria. And so the idea that 113 people at one particular university could cover all that diversity is just laughable. I don't think that stands water. I think overall, though, what we're missing with this approach to generalizability is unknown unknowns. So there are things that people aren't researching simply because it isn't part of their everyday experience. So what ends up happening is that in these partnerships, the ideas that are prioritized are inside the experience of researchers from the global north. So we end up missing things like, the huge ethnic and language diversity in Nigeria or other parts of the world. And to give you a sense of what other things might we be missing by just not having the right people coming up with the ideas, we can get tastes of this from some of the papers that already do exist or some of the projects that are ongoing. So here's a paper that I like to point out. It's investigating personal relationships in West Africa. If you're in West Africa, you'll see cultural representations like this: beware of bad friends, and I'm afraid of my friends. Yeah, even you, my friend. Which, when I first read this paper, I just thought it was so weird, because I'm American, and if you ask someone from America, who are your enemies? I don't even know how I'd answer that question. It just doesn't make sense. But this is a question that makes sense in West Africa because of the particular cultural grounding of relationship in West African countries. So whereas to a US psychologist, investigating enemyship just might not be a thing that one would think of, it would make a lot of sense to many West African psychologists, I would argue. We can also get a glimpse of this from the project from the PhD student I worked with, or am working with, Ade. Ade is doing multi-site research focused on Africa specifically. So one of the projects that he's working on right now is called Many Labs Africa. And that's exactly what it sounds. It's a many lab style study, but focused specifically on the African continent. And as part of this project, he asked his collaborators, instead of coming up with other studies on his own, or coming up with doing a replication or something, he first asked his African collaborators, what topics do you think we should be working on? And then chose studies from the African research that does exist as the basis for replication. So there was a whole voting procedure, and he did a cut to top 3 studies that we would replicate. I'll show you what these are. So one of them is on parental attitudes towards teenage pregnancy. Another one is on extramarital affairs. And a third one is on the process of negotiation of condom use and whether that process is gendered. So from my perspective, based on the research that I'm familiar with, these just aren't topics that I would think to investigate as good targets for replication. But we noticed there was a big divide between the priorities assigned by our African collaborators and our non-African collaborators. And I think this speaks to the fact that, the things that you're going to want to work on are things that are in your experience, and that it therefore makes sense to work on. So I think we are missing a lot. I'm not going to go into detail about all the things that we could do better, but I at least want to gesture at that, directions that we could explore if we really want to take the generalizability problem seriously. The first one, this one is a bit hard because maybe not a lot of you in the audience are directly science policymakers. I hope some of you are. But still, I think there's something that even we can do to lower barriers to resources. So this is addressing that problem that is looming over all of these topics, which is the resource constrained settings that we're working in the global South. So a couple ideas for you all to chew on. One is small scientific societies can indeed issue small grants. And even those small grants, if they have few restrictions, can really help alleviate some of those resource constraints. This one might be a bit harder, but some grants have their overheads capped, which is a big bummer if you're working on an institution like we are that is exclusively funded on grants. I mean, that's how we keep the lights on. It just doesn't make sense to cap those overheads. It makes us lose money on those projects. In the global north, so I think because the global north is where the resources are, it's just true that the training that you get at global north institutions is often better than you can get at a global south institution, because maybe you don't have to deal with power outages, for example. So while I think some people are reticent to actively recruit people from the global south because they think, well, maybe we should be strengthening the ecosystems in the global south. Yes, we should be doing that. And yet still, you should not exclude the idea of recruiting people from the global south at your institution, because that might be the best place for them to get the training. This next one, you might not be familiar with it unless you've had to deal with a lot of immigration issues, but getting visas in the global south can be very, very hard. Well, this is a map of where the most powerful passports are, and you can notice there's a lot of dark colors around the global south because the passports there are quite weak. The implication of this is that you might need a lead time of 6 months in order to get a visa to even attend the conference, depending on where you're coming from and where the conference is. So I'll just urge you to refer to this paper by Omid Ebrahimi talking about this issue. Basically, visas and visa restrictions are real constraints to accessing resources in the form of academic collaborations. So I'm really grateful, for example, that Joel was able to come here to AIMOS to actually network in person. That's a big deal. So things that you can do, well, giving good lead times to people from the global south so that they can go through those application processes, but also, of course, having online options. It's not the same as coming in person, but it can be something, and that can be valuable. The second one might be a bit less obvious to people here, but this is an interdisciplinary conference, so I think it makes sense to talk about it, and that is to collaborate across disciplines. Here again, my slides are going to be a little bit messed up, so just bear with me. Those are my notes to myself. But one of those areas is the area of global health. I'm just putting an example of an article up there, which is thinking about ethics in the context of cash transfer RCTs, just to show that people in global health are actively thinking about these issues. So maybe they should, maybe they have something to contribute. Another area is development economics. Development economics is not perfect. There's been a lot of discussion of ethics in development context because people had their water shut off to do some sort of experiment, and it's not great to be someone with your water shut off. On the other hand, the discussion is happening in development economics. And I'll give just one example that's quite famous in development economics, thinking through the ethical issues of doing research in countries that were colonized. So active discussion is the main point, and some efforts to make some improvements. And the last one is anthropology. There's a long history of thinking through how to do research in a respectful way in anthropology. And some of that discussion is useful, and some of it, I think, in my opinion, is less constructive. But I think anthropology has a lot to contribute. In particular, I keep pitching this article to different audiences. There's an anthropologist named Mario Schmidt who talked with a lot of people about what it was like to get money in a cash transfer RCT. And it's really worth reading. I think that general set of methods could have a lot to contribute to this discussion. And the last idea is listening. And I mean that both on the researcher side, and also to the people who are actually in the experiments on the participant side. On the research side, actually, we just got this funded, but Busara, meaning my group, has an extension with the Replicates project to try to get people from the global south, or at least who are living and working in the global south, to predict not just replicability, but generalizability to places in the global south. I think that's a form of listening. People in the global south have that context expertise. Let's leverage it. Let's see, if that does give you an edge in predicting whether findings will generalize or not to a particular setting. There's a lot more that we can do in this, but I'm just giving an example of one activity that I think might help. And the last one, I'd like Joel to come up and say a few words again. This is following up again on that experience with cash transfer RCT in Western Kenya.
Yeah, so after working in the field in the global south for a very long time and seeing the problems that have been coming up over and over again when doing research there. So at Busara, we decided to try and come up with solutions to these problems. Like, how do you conduct research in the global south in a respectful manner, listening to participants, like listening to the signals that they're giving you when doing research there. And one of the ways that we're trying to test out is this the feedback loop, where we are trying to create a framework which can guide researchers to listen better at every step of the research process, whether it's design. Like, for example, we just spoke about the cash transfer problem that we had. If we had involved participants in the design phase of this study, when coming up with the interventions, we would have known like what kind of problems these kind of interventions could create in the community. Secondly, also involving participants in the design phase can save someone a lot of time. For example, if you are trying to implement novel, nice interventions, but which can't work within that context that you want to do your study, then you know earlier on and you don't waste your time and participants' time doing it. Again, even during like the data collection phase, where now you're trying to explain to participants what you're trying to do and what the study is all about. Again, it's important to always listen to participants. Like, try to understand how they understand your project and your protocols. Like, are you in the same page? Is what you want them to understand actually what they're getting from what you're trying to explain? Because sometimes, most of, especially when doing constants, most of the constants are guided by IRBs, and IRBs, like I said, the people who work in the IRBs don't live in the communities that you're trying to, where you're going to do the research. So they'll just look at your consent vis-a-vis what is required from a legal point of view. But in most cases, that doesn't work well because the legal paper is not clear to everyone. Like, the kind of people who give data or who participate in research are not, like, the language that is used in the formal consent is not clear enough to them. And sometimes they get themselves into studies that they would otherwise not have been involved if they clearly understood what was going on. The other bit is during the analysis and trying to make sense of the findings. It's one thing to get data and you sitting down your computer trying to make sense of that data, and there are the findings that you actually get from that and the conclusions you draw from that data. It's also important to go back to the community and see whether you're still on the same page. You might have misinterpreted what they actually told you, and it's critical that once you've done your analysis, you've written your summaries, just go back to the community, just sample a few and sense check your findings. Just make sure that you're interpreting the results correctly, because sometimes we as researchers, after data collection and analysis, we just disappear and come back again when you want more data from the participants. You just publish a paper and then that's done. You just move on to the next paper. And we're trying to change that, to make sure that you're just coming back to the community again, share the findings, sense check the findings, making sure that you're on the same page. The other thing is update protocols. Every time you're listening, you just not listening and documenting and doing nothing. Just need to find ways to make your study better as you continue. Like as you get information from participants, as you listen to them, like how do you make changes to your design without changing the overall objectives? And this is a loop that continues throughout the cycle. You listen at every point and do something about it, not just listen and save the findings in your computer and then forget about it. So at Busara, we are in the research ethics agenda that I'm leading. We are developing a framework to guide researchers on how to do this in the simplest way possible, which does not increase the costs of doing research. Just making it simple and making sure that we are all listening better for good quality data and making sure that the findings that we get when interacting with the communities reflects the realities that they live in, not just our own assumptions.
Thanks for your attention.
Come back up, John. Sure. Patrick. So we've got time for questions now. So does anyone have any questions? Right in the back. Have we got roving mics? Bella? We don't?
Yeah,
Okay. So booming voice.
I can project, that's okay. Thanks for that, Patrick and Joel. That was fantastic, super interesting. I guess on with a lot of things that you talked about at this conference. I love the idea of working with the organization and other universities that can go for the same resources or people power, whatever it is. But I guess I'm interested to know where you find much pushback is in relation to publication or grants or anything else, just because I imagine that as with anything that's generally in at the center, it's not straightforward to go and say, hey, I want to set up a partnership or I want to work with people. So is there somewhere that you found where you need to push a little harder or maybe scream a little bit and say, hey, we should get this done or it should happen?
Yeah, good question. So one thing I want to emphasize first is that I'm not speaking for every country and every university and every researcher. I'm just speaking based on what I've learned from working at Busara in the time that I have. I just take meetings and, so treat me as not necessarily a fully credible resource to speak to the whole context, just based on my. One thing that I've noticed is that the incentive in, say, for academics in Kenya does seem to be not quite the same as the incentive for, say, academics in Europe or Australia. Because, for example, the policy-making process in Kenya puts a strong emphasis on research evidence. But what they mean by research evidence is like evidence about the specific context. So if you're dealing with water problems, it might be evidence about water problems. So what might result from that, it could go in a journal, but often it goes to a government report. And that's like something that a lot of Kenyan academics want to contribute to. So like when you're thinking about research collaborations in that context, the goal might not even be generalization. It's thinking about the specific context. And likewise, the thing that might get you kudos in your university isn't necessarily the published paper. Maybe it's like a citation in a report or something like that. So that's a different perspective on that process. That said, there are plenty of academics. There's so many academics in the global south. There are plenty of people who are motivated to get into their national journals or whatever. So that can be an incentive. But the barrier, I think, is more like understanding and developing that mutual understanding of what everybody's goals are. And so it's that onboarding process where things slip up and where misunderstandings happen. And yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, sure.
Hey, I have a question about this study on psychotherapy and cash. You mentioned the control group was made unhappy by not receiving treatment. Would this mean that the treatment effect is biased in some way? And I guess the second question, continuing from that, is how much of this, the difficulties that are faced in the field and the implementation actually make it?
Yeah, really good questions both. On the second one, not always that much. So one constraint is NDAs, for example. For example, the implementing partner that worked on the psychotherapy piece is not mentioned in the paper because they didn't like the results. I mean, that's just the reality of it. And they also had some teeth that they could use to, prevent some things from being disclosed. So in nonprofit settings, at least, or also like settings where you're working with implementing partners, that is a real constraint on fully free sharing, is that sometimes there are legal restrictions on that free sharing. On the first piece, yes, that is exactly, there was spillover, however you want to talk about it, contamination. What happened was, if you find out that your neighbor suddenly got 2 months' salary, whereas you didn't get it and you don't know why, that is going to build some resentment, especially if you don't have a complete explanation of like, well, we're going to learn about what money does in general, or maybe you don't even care about that. I've also heard stories, I'm not familiar with the specific example here, but there's another cash transfer study. I think this happened in South Africa, where the participants actually set up an insurance scheme so that if your neighbor was in the control group, they got a small insurance payout from you. And so it defrayed everybody's risk. It seems pretty smart to me, but maybe not so nice for the researchers who want to learn about the impact of cash. So this is an issue that comes up in a lot of development contexts, and spillover is a real issue.
Okay, too many. I'm going to go with Barbara.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow on that last question, because it seems to me an example of the need to publish negative trial results going further than whether the trial itself is published or not, but also what went wrong in the trial. It's almost like that the side in terms of partial publication of trials for drug treatments, where if a certain outcome measure is not published, it's a problem. Because to me, when I look at it, I think, okay, that design loop should have been started at the light blue to begin with. And then also that there's a kind of analysis question here of whether working with communities, giving individuals within that community cash payments and other within the community not giving them is actually the wrong unit of analysis if you accept that happiness has to do with a person's social situation, in which case you'd actually randomize whole communities.
Yeah,
Just kind of a thought with the framing.
I mean, I love the idea. I think there was in this particular paper, there was like some clustering by community to try to account for some of these issues. But I can't remember the exact details, sorry about that. But I love the idea of having more complete documentation of some of the social side effects or spillovers or whatever you want to call it, or some of the extra stuff that you had to do. I think that's a fantastic idea. We've tried to do a little bit of that in Busara with, if we have some time, we'll write a commentary or a blog post or something to like get some of these learnings and package them in a way that other people can hear about them. But it's an ongoing challenge where we have this budget tied to a particular project, and we can't, if we're charging our time to that project and we're doing stuff that's outside of the exact deliverables, we can go over budget. If we want to do a project that's not paid for, we just have to like make sure we're making profit on all of our projects, and that can be quite hard. So it's been a challenge to like try to like accumulate all of these together. But if there's more explicit accounting for that at the proposal stage, that would work. Or if there's a registry of development focused projects, I don't know of one right now, but something similar to the clinical trials registry, say in the United States, you know, that could address a lot of these issues. And I think it's a fantastic idea.
Jen?
Oh, thank you. That was really exciting. Yes, in research in the global north, there's a lot of discussion about including the minority voice, even people who are minority. Would you comment on the challenges of doing that in the global south?
Yeah, well, I guess I could say I don't know a lot about it. So I'm not going to pretend that I know something that I don't. However, one thing I can comment on is that on that topic, I think, so there's this issue in behavioral science, especially psychology, which is my home discipline, which is that discussions about minorities get reflected through the prism of minority relations in the United States. And they get projected onto the global south where the context is just different. So it doesn't really apply. So I'll give one example. I used to work on implicit bias interventions, which is like a really hot topic in the United States. Spoiler alert, I think it's not very useful. I think I used to be in the minority, maybe I'm not anymore. But implicit bias is one of those topics where a lot of discussion of minority issues got reflected through the prism of implicit bias, which you know, the United States has this unique relationship with race relations where there's this emphasis on equality that goes back to the founding, but there's this countervailing strand of people who want to keep minorities out or don't like Black people or whatever. But so it leads to this dynamic where people are very anxious, I guess, and that's where I think the idea of implicit bias comes from, as that anxiety. But that just may not apply outside of that unique or historical context. So while I do want to say I don't know much about it, and each country has its own unique history and relationship with minorities. Nigeria has, you know, all those ethnic groups, so minority relationships are going to be very different there. What I can say is though is that particular topic I think does get reflected through a lens that is maybe inappropriate, and that's another place where considering the country and the context on its own terms could have a lot of benefit.
I'm going to end it there. I'm sorry to everyone else who had questions, but we are running a little bit. So thanks everyone. If everyone can round of applause to Patrick and Bella. And just another plug for on day 3 of the conference, we have a mini note session on big team science. So we can discuss more of this topic on Wednesday. So now we're going to have a half-hour break, morning tea. Yep. Just out here, and then we'll be back in this theatre for some lightning talks.
Yeah.